while you were sleeping, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has effectively announced preparations for elections in Ukraine and has launched the election campaign. And in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, they even stated that they are preparing a legislative framework to make it possible to hold elections during wartime. Volodymyr Zelensky, responding to Donald Trump's Kremlin-influenced criticism, says he is ready to hold presidential elections immediately. But in that case, let the United States of America guarantee Ukraine's security from Russian shelling, and do it now. Some experts insist that it's time to prepare for very difficult elections, but others are sure that Zelensky is simply trying to take the Trump card away from Donald Trump and put the United States president in a difficult position. It's interesting that the Russians, who were shouting so loudly about Volodymyr's illegitimacy, have now declared that Ukraine can't hold elections right now, saying it's illegal, that it's manipulation, and so on. So, I suggest that in this episode we figure out whether Ukraine has actually gotten closer to presidential elections, and how we should understand Zelensky's statement about being ready for an election campaign. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any detailed comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. President Volodymyr Zelensky responded to Donald Trump's calls for elections in Ukraine. He stated directly that Western partners have publicly spoken about the need for elections more than once, and therefore the time has come to hold those very elections. Quote, "I don't want Ukraine to have a weak position, for someone to be able to use the absence of elections as some kind of argument against Ukraine. That's why I respond to our partners," said the President of the United States, "that everyone wants to end the war, and that it can't be that Ukrainians will drag out this moment, supposedly because of holding one position or another that he is allegedly clinging to it. And that's why, of course, I'm in favor of further elections." Zelensky clarified that he asked the members of the Ukrainian parliament to prepare legislative changes regarding the possibility of holding elections during martial law, so that no one would think that his statement about elections is just a media signal. Quote, "Today it is important to end the war, and it is important to end it from a strong position. There was a signal from the United States to Ukraine regarding the elections. I responded and am ready for this. There are two important things that need to be worked out: security and legislation. Therefore, my request to Ukraine's key partners and to Ukrainian parliamentarians is to show how both of these things can be worked out. I'd like to remind you that earlier United States President Donald Trump said Ukraine needs presidential elections because they supposedly haven't been held in a long time. Later, he repeated his statement and added that the issue of elections seems to be one of the most discussed among Ukrainian citizens. He claimed Zelensky is using the war as an excuse to avoid holding elections. And here I can confidently say that Zelensky's statement about the elections would not have appeared if it weren't for Donald Trump's statement. And in this sense, Zelensky's reaction was quick and as specific as possible. "You want elections? No problem. Actually, to the war and the legislation." Zelensky directly told Donald Trump elections are needed, but the war remains. Every day, hundreds of Russian drones and dozens of missiles strike Ukrainian cities and villages. And in Kyiv itself, let's put it this way, there are days when its residents sit for 10 hours straight without electricity. The strikes hit not only military targets and energy infrastructure, but also residential apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, stores, and so on. And let's be honest, regardless of your attitude towards Zelensky, but this is not the best time to start election campaigning, rallies, and organizing voting. And there's another important point here. Let me emphasize, the addresses of all polling stations will be made publicly available. And if, for example, Russia wanted for some reason to disrupt the will of the Ukrainian people, it could simply strike at these coordinators, at these addresses, and then after the fact declare them military targets. Well, that's what Russia always does. First, a Russian missile strikes a school, a hospital, or a store. A few hours later, the Kremlin just says there was a military headquarters and mercenaries there, and so on. That's the whole simple scheme. The second problem is organizational. The current election laws in Ukraine do not provide answers to questions, for example, about how to organize voting for several million refugees from the war. After all, it's already clear that polling stations in embassy and consulate buildings won't be able to accommodate even a small fraction of the people who are outside Ukraine and want to vote. So, how can the electoral process be organized in Western countries for Ukrainians? But an even more important question is, how will hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian armed forces soldiers on the front lines vote? How will the military on the front lines vote? According to the law, they can become presidential candidates and run an election campaign. How? And they have the right to do so. They have the right not only to vote, but also to be elected. But how do you do that? Well, there's the most basic problem: money for these elections. Elections are not a cheap pleasure. So, considering all these problems, why did Zelensky say that he is ready to hold elections in the near future? And here's where it gets really interesting. Volodymyr Zelensky is calling Donald Trump's bluff. We discussed two problems earlier, and now Zelensky says Kiev will handle the second one, Zelensky himself. There is indeed no ban on holding presidential elections during wartime in the constitution of Ukraine, so it makes sense to lift the legal ban on election campaigns during martial law. So, elections can technically occur, but legal resolution for campaigns isn't possible. The issue of voting during a special period is a non-trivial task, but if it's really necessary, it can be implemented. And Zelensky has already instructed the Verkhovna Rada to develop all the legislative mechanisms. That's why he says, listen, there are two problems. We'll take care of one, we'll solve all of that, but the first problem remains, the war. And in fact, this is actually the main reason why the elections are not being held. And so Zelensky says to Trump, if you really want elections and we don't mind, then help us make them real. Make it so that the participants in these elections can hold campaign rallies, so that soldiers can return from the front, run for office and campaign if they want to. So that people aren't afraid to go to polling stations. So that election commission members can count the votes without fearing that a Shahed or Caliber strike will disrupt the counting process. That overall there will be a safe environment. Elections can be held after a long ceasefire begins, which is exactly what Ukraine is demanding in peace negotiations. Ukraine has repeatedly said it's ready for a ceasefire first, then negotiations, starting with a truce, then discussing elections, peace agreements, and more. But Putin doesn't want that, and now the ball is clearly in Trump's court. And let me give you a rock-solid argument as to why Donald Trump himself wouldn't want elections in Ukraine. The thing is, Zelensky can say right now that he will only hold elections if the United States of America sends American observers to every polling station across Ukraine. So that Donald Trump can be sure the elections were fair, but the question is, will Trump risk American lives? I don't think so, so I'll sum up with a statement about the elections. Zelensky simply passed the ball to Washington and confirmed that he's not afraid of the elections. Besides, in my opinion, at the moment, fortunately or unfortunately, no one except Zelensky has any chance to quickly run a powerful election campaign in Ukraine. It's impossible. If you doubt it, consider this. Under martial law, there are restrictions on freedom of assembly and rallies, there are restrictions on freedom of speech objectively, there is a curfew and so on and so forth. So how can any candidate in such a situation promote themselves as a leader, hold rallies, campaign, and so on? There's no way. Absolutely no way. During wartime, you can't run a proper campaign. That's why we're left with a choice between Zelensky, Poroshenko, and so on. Those already in power make it hard to call these elections fair, since no military person can truly run or campaign properly. But what's funny in this situation is that in the Kremlin they actually got scared of these elections in Ukraine, even the potential ones. Today, the press drunkard of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Mashka Zakharova, said that Zelensky doesn't need elections in the usual sense. Quote, Zelensky needs elections of himself. Supposedly, elections in Ukraine are impossible right now because there are no candidates and so on. It's ironic that just yesterday, unwashed Russians claimed Zelensky is illegitimate and questioned why he isn't holding elections. And today, when Zelensky says, yes, okay, let's hold elections, these same Russians say, no, elections aren't needed because now the elections are illegitimate and so on. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any new episodes. Friends, if you found this episode interesting and you think my work is necessary and important, you can support this YouTube channel financially with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video it says, support Alexey Pechiy's channel. Choose any format that is convenient for you. Thank you for any support. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.